Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Well, hello and welcome to the newest iteration of Maritime Matters. We are becoming a little bit slack. This is definitely not a weekly podcast, but it does allow us to bring more content. Now, we are recording this on Monday, the 14th of July, which makes me worry, where has the year gone? So if anything happens in the next 24 hours and we didn't incorporate it, that is why. Richard, how are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. Not too bad. I've not been managing to get up to all that much recently, but it's the start of our academic term, so all hands on deck trying to get ready for teaching. Whereas you've been about and in the media a huge amount, as always.
I have. I've got to say, though, it was good to see. Thank you for all of those who gave well wishes for Richard to get better. I'm not sure I gave him any sympathy or empathy, so you made up for that. So thank you for those. And it's
yes, thank you. That is very true.
You also look like, I don't know if it's your camera, but you also look like you have a tan, which makes me think you've been. No, it's your camera.
Nah, it's probably the camera. Either that, or it's the pommy skin reacting to even the winter Australian sunshine.
Potentially. Look, I've been up to a little bit. Obviously, lots happening in the world at the moment. So that's caused a lot of discussion around AUKUS, which we will touch on later in this podcast, but we won't delve into too much because, again, nothing has really changed. On that, though, I do have a piece out today with Lois, the interpreter, talking about AUKUS and specifically about Submarine Rotation Force West and responding to some of the comments that have been made from government and non-government officials in predominantly the US about actually, is Australia really on track? So I kind of talk about that. I think we are on track, but I think that there is some confidence building that we could do to kind of stave off some of those comments around timelines for infrastructure build. So we'll put a link to that, but check that piece out in Lois the Interpreter. So lots has been happening in the region. We are recording this the day after exercise Talisman Sabre has commenced, which is a pretty significant exercise. Looks to be the largest iteration. I do think that is in the press release every year. That might be because it's true. But Talisman Sabre is kicking off. So it did commence yesterday. This is the 11th iteration of exercise Talisman Sabre. Now, Talisman Sabre, I think we've touched on before, is often referred to as a bilateral exercise between the US and Australia. I think bilateral because it's planned between the two countries, but it is very much a multilateral exercise. So the facts and figures at the moment, it's a 3-week exercise. The reports say more than 35,000 personnel, which is pretty big, from Australia and partnering nations participating. It's occurring in Queensland, the Northern Territory, Western Australia, New South Wales, Christmas Island, and for the first time also Papua New Guinea. And I think that's significant because Talisman Sabre in many ways used to always be a Queensland activity. I remember then it expanded to the Northern Territory and there was a lot of concerns about logistics with that. And so now it's growing significantly in terms of the number of locations. I think Christmas Island is fascinating. There's long been a comment that we don't make the most of Christmas Island and Cocos and Keeling, which are in pretty important strategic areas, especially if you want to, deploy a Army HIMARS unit or something like that. I'm not saying they're doing that, but key strategic areas. Some of the countries that are participating, obviously US, Australia, forces from Canada, Fiji, France, Germany, India, and there's India for the first time, Indonesia, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, Republic of Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Tonga, and the UK are participating, and then Malaysia and Vietnam observing. So that is, if you look at the development of Talisman Sabre in the last 10 years, that is incredibly significant. What would be your take on Talisman Sabre?
It's a huge exercise now, isn't it? It's kind of become one of the sort of really premier regional exercises, and it's as you've kind of hinted at, it's the push towards more kind of sophisticated elements of warfighting, and some of the kit that's here indicates that not only the Australian kind of kit, but also the UK Carrier Strike Group, the US amphib, all of this kind of really quite high end kit. But there's also, I think it's interesting to see the push into PNG, and I think we've mentioned this before. The idea of it becoming almost more of a layered kind of exercise with lots of different things aimed at different sort of partners, and drawing that kind of both regional and extra-regional group of nations together is a pretty significant kind of achievement. And I think there's obviously really important defense capability elements to this, but there's also some pretty significant kind of defense diplomacy and wider signaling sort of elements to it as well. I thought I'd mention the flag, the thing that's already got the media's interest, which is the Chinese spy ship question. And is there going to be a spy ship? Are they coming? I think it was Pat Conroy who said sort of most likely, and I would be amazed if they didn't, and I would be sort of I don't really see why it is the big news story that it will be every year. The West and the US and Japan and others keep a pretty close eye on what it is that the Chinese are up to, and I don't think that there's any particular reason why we should see anything different from the other side. So I thought I'd try and pop that balloon before it inflates too much, but I know I'll have absolutely no impact on the wider narrative.
Well, I actually think I have a slightly different take on you on the Chinese spy ship, and I think that I think my modus operandi of late has been whether it's talking about AUKUS or PLN task groups or firings, gunnery firings conducted by a PLN task group in March. That yesterday I read a report where I was like, this is a missile firing. It's like, no, fundamentally different, and yeah, that would be aggressive. A gunnery firing 340 nautical miles from the coast is not. So I'm normally aligned with you, but I actually think we should care a bit about this Chinese spy ship. I can see why the media cares right now. I mean, for those that are not Australian and following the Australian media, the Australian Prime Minister is currently in China for a 6-day visit. But I think, yes, there's this equivalency thing, and yes, countries all do observe each other's exercises, but Australia does not send spy ships to observe China's exercises. We don't do that. That said, I don't think we should get overhyped about it. I agree with you that countries do observe each other's exercises using all different kinds of means. But it is interesting, though. You're right. The Defence Industry Minister in Australia, Pat Conroy, acting Defence Minister at the moment, I think, did say yesterday on TV that of course we expect one. CDF's come out and said the same thing, but they said, it's not here yet. Which I mean, we know where there's. I would suspect we know where their spy ships are. I know that there was reports this morning of one causing some grief in the West Philippine Sea, observing a US Philippine exercise. So who knows? But look, I agree. It's over dramatized. Look, Talisman Sabre, I think is great, and I do think often we are critical, and I think when we come to the LHD ANAO report, we're probably going to be quite critical of a couple of things. But I do think it's like I am incredibly impressed with how much Talisman Sabre has evolved since my days of planning it, how much it's become a multilateral exercise. And when a multilateral exercise occurs, there are constraints on the complexity of the exercise, right? But in many ways, it seems to be a multilateral exercise that still has a significant degree of warfighting complexity. And I think that does send a key message to the region. And I think it's good that China is watching that message. But we must move on from Talisman Sabre. What else has been happening?
So I guess kind of on a similar alliance-y kind of note, there's been an announcement or a brief statement about an agreement between the US, Australia, and Japan over naval logistics, and I think this is. It's very much building on established practices, particularly between the US and Japan and the US and Australia. But I think the trilateral element of this, and it's an agreement that's looking to kind of enhance logistics interoperability and enable greater support between vessels from the three countries. Now, you could be a distinctly cynical individual and say this is particularly important for the Royal Australian Navy at the moment, and it is a somewhat one-way kind of relationship. But I think maybe that's me being a bit too harsh. Because for those who aren't perhaps regular listeners, the two Australian resupply ships are currently out of service, as far as we're aware, certainly as far as I'm aware, and have been for some time. So the RAN would be very much on the receiving end of these logistics arrangements. But it is an important step, sort of again, about knitting together these three countries in a kind of on the practical levels of engagement. So I think, just interesting again to see this sort of thing going on.
Agree. And I actually, maybe I'm glass half full today. I might not be once we get down to the list of things. But again, I think this is a really positive development. You know, often we focus on the challenges, and right now in Australia there is this discussion about what exactly is the Pentagon asking of Australia as part of the AUKUS review, and I very much think it's overblown. If you're interested in my thoughts on that, I'll put a link. I did an interview on RN Breakfast last week where we kind of talked about the feasibility of things like requesting a public commitment from Australia on a timeline scenario, which I guess we'll delve into. So I won't steal our thunder, but I like this. I think, again, as much as I think that Australia, Department of Defence deserve a pat on the back about Talisman Sabre, I think they deserve a pat on the back about the rapid development and integration of the Australia-Japan relationship, and then also the trilateral elements of that. Like I can't emphasize enough. I remember 11 years ago planning a bilateral exercise with Japan, and it was really difficult. There just wasn't a lot of interest, or it felt like that. Now we're 11 years down the track. I mean, we have the reciprocal access agreements. We did have a logistical agreement now. This is an upgrade, a trilateral upgrade. We're more frequently operating together. I think there was actually a couple of weeks ago, was it a photo of HMAS Sydney replenishing with a Japanese tanker. All of our multilateral exercises, seem to have Japan involved. There's obviously the capability discussions around the general purpose frigate. I think that the way that relationship has developed, and I think that the way that both governments of different flavors and also Departments of Defence have leaned into it, I think is significant. I think that's a tick. And that's a positive achievement. So it's a glass half full. Great news. What else has been happening?
The Houthi-backed rebels have restarted their campaign against shipping. Again, it has been framed through the lens of the Israeli-Gaza conflict and presented as attacks on shipping that is breaking some kind of blockade. Obviously, it doesn't meet any kind of international law framing of that, and there's some significant kind of questions about the degree to which some of these ships have connections with Israel, but there are broader shipping connections with Israel. But they've now sunk 2 vessels in the Red Sea, the Eternity Sea and the Magic Seas. Both of these were attacked primarily by small ships and then boarded. And as part of this, a number of mariners have been killed. We're still a little bit uncertain about precise numbers, but some of the reporting says that 4 mariners from the Eternity Sea were killed, and a number of others remain missing. Some of them they had to abandon ship, and some of them were picked up sort of 24 to 48 hours later from the open seas. So really kind of, I guess, depressing, and it's a really sad state where, as ever, it's the mariners, it's the crew. I think many of these the crew were from Indonesia, who are paying the price for effectively somebody else's conflict in all kind of ways. So really sad on that note, and obviously significant in terms of the impact on shipping and trade through the Red Sea. And again, coming back to kind of obviously grand announcements that the US had solved this problem, and that the bombing campaign had resolved and had provided freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, proved to be a false dawn, unfortunately.
Yeah, look, it is sad news, and it does reiterate, as you said, that it really is merchant mariners that really bear the brunt of a lot of these things, and very sad to see the loss of life. And I think that um, they're not the first merchant mariners to be killed as part of the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. And I think often the reporting and the discussions really lose sight of who it is that really is being targeted. And it is innocent civilians on ships that, some of which have no clear connection whatsoever with that conflict in any way, shape, or form. So it is sad news, and I think it just highlights that this. We've spoken about this a lot in terms of the Houthi challenge in the Red Sea. That it's not going away anytime soon. It's very clear that US, UK, and in fact, I think just under a month ago, or maybe a couple of weeks ago, also renewed Israeli strikes on Houthi targets. Really aren't being effective. And so I think this is going to continue to be a challenge, and it does highlight how easy it is really for a motivated actor to hold at risk a key choke point, despite sustained attacks.
Absolutely. Now, we've talked around it a little bit, but I feel that we ought to at least briefly touch on the elephant in the room that is, I guess, AUKUS, but I don't really like to talk about it in terms of AUKUS, because I kind of feel like it's a lot bigger than AUKUS. It's about the Australia-US kind of defence relationship, and the reports that the Pentagon, and they've been kind of dripping out reasonably regularly, but I guess they came out again in, I think, a piece in the FT a couple of days ago, that the Pentagon is putting significant pressure on Australia, not merely to raise its defence budget, but also to clarify its position with regard to the Taiwan contingency, effectively, or more broadly, a US conflict with China. So you've set out your thoughts. What are your what were the headlines from your interview?
Look, things have evolved since the weekend. My interview on Friday with RN was talking about demands about potentially having to invest more in the US submarine industrial base under the AUKUS banner, and also public and private commitments on Taiwan. Over the weekend, the discussion has evolved around broader commitments to what Australia would do in the event of conflict, and back to Australian defence spending. I guess I kind of highlight a couple of things, right? Firstly, it's not actually clear what is happening, and I think the media doing their job jumps on a lot of these things. A month ago when we heard about the AUKUS review, everybody thought it was clear. It was 30-day review, etc., etc. But the Department of Defense from the US never actually put a release about this AUKUS review, so we never knew that, but we took that as fact. It's come out during the last week that that's clearly not the case. This is more of a prolonged review of AUKUS, and actually potentially it's not really about AUKUS in terms of Australia's acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. It's more about understanding the boundaries of the relationship. The reporting about this being about Australia committing to a Taiwan scenario, look, I've had some reliable people talk to me about this, but I still am quite skeptical on this. The US's position is strategic ambiguity. The US is not tone deaf enough to think that the Australian government, any Australian government of any flavour, would ever commit publicly to anything like that, or in fact privately, because it just bounds you. So I do find it hard to believe, despite I've had people tell me this is the thing, but I actually find it hard to believe that's what the discussion is about. There was some reporting over the weekend. This is actually a broader discussion about roles and responsibilities. And I think that if that is the discussion, I actually think that's an entirely helpful discussion and one that we should very much be having. It may or may not be tied to AUKUS. I think it probably isn't. One of the things that I pointed to, I gave a speech last week at the United States Study Centre where I talked about ANZUS. And we often talk about and quote ANZUS, but we forget that ANZUS signed in 1951 has really 8 operative articles, most of which are entirely vague, right? The relationship isn't built on ANZUS. The relationship is built on how have we explored it through exercises, through war games, through operations. And as we're looking at the potential of a crisis or a conflict in the region that would be quite different to what we've worked on together, I think it makes sense that the countries explore what are the boundaries, how do we operate together, what are our commitments. And I think that's probably where the conversation is. I suspect maybe there's an element of, and again, I'm hypothesizing, like I don't know, but an element of wanting Australia to be more deeply engaged in the political level of scenario planning and wargaming around things that could happen in the region. That's something I've heard before for the last couple of years as something being pressed by the US, and I think that would be positive. So I think we need to be careful about reading too much into what is being leaked, and also remember that when things are leaked to the media, they are leaked for an agenda, right? Like clearly the AUKUS review was leaked around putting pressure on Australian defence spending. Clearly this conversation right now is about putting pressure on Australia as the Australian Prime Minister visits China. So I think we need to be careful not to read too much into it. What's your take?
Yeah, I guess I have a different take. I think I see this as kind of more problematic than that. I absolutely agree with you that greater clarity on roles and responsibilities is needed from an external view of where we are. But I do feel that is a conversation that is best had quietly behind closed doors, and that the way in which this has been framed, I don't necessarily think it is just that.
Mm-hmm.
I also, or at least I'm skeptical that it is just that. I also think it's your point about the kind of the confusion and the lack of clarity. I think is absolutely right, but I kind of would push that as a real problem, particularly in terms of American foreign policy, defense, the way in which the relationship is managed is so confused, and that in and of itself is deeply problematic and very difficult for the Australian government. And I'm not one who generally has a huge amount of time for politicians, but I do have distinct sympathy for those desperately trying to manage the differing pressures that are coming from Washington, whether that be in Europe or elsewhere in Australia. I think it's a quite the time to be a diplomat or a political leader. And I guess my kind of final point would be that I actually think there is significant appetite, certainly amongst some in DC, for this kind of much greater clarity on certain contingencies. Bridge Colby was saying this last year. I ended up having an exchange with him on Twitter about precisely this, because he was making it very clear that he believed that in exchange for transfers of Virginia-class submarines, there needed to be a cast iron commitment that they would be used in a conflict with China. And I kind of pointed out that that's not really how alliances work, and that you can't expect them to make this kind of those kind of commitments. But I can see, I find it very difficult to sort of look at what's happening now without looking at it through the lens of those kind of previous statements that have been made, and suggesting that there is a desire for that in Washington, or at least in bits of Washington and bits of the Pentagon. And again, I think part of the problem is this kind of very confused messaging that comes through on a whole range of issues, whether it's arms transfers to Ukraine, or the trade relationship with Japan, or on this kind of thing. So I'm more glass half empty, but maybe that's just today.
Look, they're all incredibly fair points. I mean, I think that this is not a great way of managing the relationship. The leaking, the messaging, all of that sort of stuff, and it must be incredibly difficult and frustrating for the Australian government and also for the Department of Defence. I'm not endorsing that. I just don't think it is necessarily a crisis in the alliance. Could it become one? I mean, maybe, but I don't think that's where we are now. And I think there's also, I mean, I'm always skeptical when things are leaked. Why are they leaked? And there's a lot now being attributed to Rich Colby, a personality in the Pentagon, and talking about that position, the Undersecretary for Defense Policy and Strategy, or something like that, in a way that we've never talked about that position, which makes me think there's also an agenda there about identifying that person as part of the crisis as well. So, look, you might be right. I completely agree. It's not a comfortable time. Right. So I think we've spent enough time talking about AUKUS. So capability developments. What has been happening, Richard? There's been a few interesting ones.
There have, and I'll start off by talking about one that I saw and I did think was quite interesting. And this was the transfer of or discussions of a transfer. I don't think it's been formally agreed yet, but of 6, and I'm going to absolutely butcher the pronunciation of this, but Abukumba class destroyer escorts, which are Japanese kind of late Cold War, early 1990s era, relatively small vessels, to the Philippines Navy. Now, I think this is a really kind of interesting sort of development. It is very much part of a really significant sort of step up in Japanese engagement into Southeast Asia, or defense engagement. They've always been very much engaged in Southeast Asia, particularly in terms of aid and development and things like that. But defense, it's a kind of a new step for them. This could be a really significant addition to the Philippines Navy, which, whilst they've got some new vessels, particularly Korean-built new vessels, which are pretty capable, the vast majority of the Philippines Navy is pretty old and very limited. So this could be a really quite important capability addition. These are sort of all-round vessels, but broadly focused on ASW, and this obviously is an important gap, I guess, for the Philippines Navy. So it could be a really interesting development in that kind of way. And it raises a whole load of kind of constitutional and legal questions for Japan that they're going to have to work through as part of this, in terms of the transfer of military capability to another nation. But Japan is a country which they end up decommissioning their vessels pretty relatively early in their kind of lifespan. And so I think more broadly, you could see a kind of a wider set of developments around this, in terms of Japan becoming, I guess, the hub or the base of more capability, if this happens to work and work successfully. So I thought that was a really interesting little story that didn't get much attention as far as I saw it. So hopefully it all works out, and the Philippines Navy end up getting the destroyer escorts. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think that. Sorry, you just caught me. I was just really responding to someone via text message. Look, I think this is great. I think this is good. Now, there have been some criticisms. They're old. What kind of sustainment package is coming with them? How much is it going to cost for the Philippines to look after it? Does the Philippines Navy really need older craft that's going to cause this pressure, limited anti-air warfare capability, etc., etc. But I think that if you look at the challenge that the Philippines Navy has right now, actually it's a challenge of scale and being able to be in multiple places at once with a limited number of ships. And the kind of threats they're dealing with right now is more actually presence, ramming, that sort of stuff. So I think it's positive. I think that certainly seeing Japan expand into I guess exporting capabilities into the region is also positive. We know that exporting capabilities creates that connectivity. We have seen Japan donate or sell, I'm not sure which, coast guards to the Philippines. Coast Guard vessels to the Philippine Navy. So this is kind of Philippine Coast Guard. This is one step up in capability. So I think it's positive. It might actually mean too that Australia is not, if Australia's general purpose frigate is going to be the Megami, which that decision hasn't been made yet. The rumours are the decision is going to be made shortly by the Australian government in terms of which future frigate Australia will acquire. But if Australia does select the Megami, perhaps Australia actually won't be the first country to have a warship exported to them from Japan, which has been a key discussion point. It might actually be the Philippines. So look, I think it's positive. Yeah. Other capability things, speaking of, well, this isn't positive, this is just weird. So you know how you butchered the name of those destroyers, which I'm not even going to attempt to say. There is some news. So one of the, I guess maybe I would say loosely friends of the show, I did a podcast with H.I. Sutton last year. H.I. Sutton is somebody who does a lot of open source intelligence on uncrewed surface vessels, uncrewed underwater vehicles, and submarines, but also just weird things happening in the military domain, right? So watch me butcher this. So in the capability space, there's some reporting that that China has developed a Ekranoplan, a winging ground aircraft, basically. So I remember when I was studying, and for anyone listening here that was a ship diver or a seaman officer, you know that you had to rote learn rules of the road or collision regulations, and you'd always have to rote learn about winging ground aircraft. You're like, what the something is a winging ground aircraft? I've never seen that at sea. Why am I memorizing this rule? Anyway, so I was really excited to see this reporting about China moving into wing in ground aircraft. So what is a winging ground aircraft? Well, a winging ground aircraft is an aircraft that is designed to fly just above the surface of the water. Why do they do this? Reportedly, it means that they can be more efficient. It allows them to fly below the radar horizon, but they're faster than a ship. And so historically, really the only country that seems to have explored these, and if you're a wing and ground expert, by the way, and you're going to challenge this, I'm happy to defer to you. But from my reading, the country that's really explored this capability is the Soviet Union. They built a bunch of these. There was a famous one that was called the Caspian Sea Monster. And there were some that were armed with missiles, etc. They were huge. They were built during the Cold War for a whole heap of different roles. Now, the images that have come up of this Chinese Ekranoplan or winging ground aircraft don't seem to be built for those kind of roles. It's a unique grey painted aircraft. It looks like it has about 4 jets on it. Not the same size of some of these, Caspian Sea Monster winging ground aircraft, etc. It looks like it could be used potentially for transporting troops, potentially also maybe as a flying boat used for search and rescue and firefighting. So not really clear. But I think the interesting point from this reporting from H.I. Sutton is he's found this imagery that shows that China is looking at winging ground, or the Chinese military is looking at winging ground aircraft and what role could they possibly have. So I just think that's an interesting capability one. Can you say Ekranoplan?
Yeah, I mean, I've always quite liked them. I always thought they were quite fun and cool bits of kit, and the way they exploit kind of the ground effect. I always think, the physics of it baffles me, and how you can have these very, very large. Some of the Soviet ones were very large bits of kit, effectively flying. But
so you are in a Ekranoplan.
I am not, absolutely not. I've just gone on a fair few Wikipedia and other sources.
Right.
Sort of rabbit holes at various points down the years. But I think it's interesting to see, and quite how they would end up being used, what they would end up being used for. Who knows? Even if it's anything that's actually kind of government sponsored, or is something more of a flight of fancy as it were, for want of a better phrase. But certainly interesting to see these kind of ideas and these kind of technologies that I think most people thought ended up in a Cold War dustbin, being pulled out again.
And I know you want to move on, but before you move on, I think there's one other point that I kind of want to like. It does show when you look at this, whatever this Acrano plan wing ground aircraft is going to be useful. When you look at the bridge barges that we discussed earlier in the year, it does show this kind of, certainly within the PLA, this thinking out of the box to solve certain capability issues. And I think that's kind of a really important point, because often when we talk about, and I'm incredibly guilty of it, I've got to say, when we talk about capabilities, I think Dib talked about this in his review in 1986, and we're still here, 40 years later. We always talk about like for like replacement. So, yep, we've got some old frigates, we need some new frigates, and we do need new frigates in Australia. I'm not saying that we don't. But this ability to think outside of the box and think about what are the other capabilities and how else could you solve a problem. Now, maybe I'm reading too much into the PLA's capabilities, but I just think that's an interesting point.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it kind of speaks also to a broader notion that actually we're getting now to the first time since the Cold War where you have previously everyone sort of looked up to the Americans and kind of, to a degree, copied on a smaller scale largely what the Americans have done. And we're now getting to the stage where there is another superpower which has its own R&D train and its own way of viewing its strategic challenges, with sufficient resources and everything else to actually start from blank sheet and start saying, okay, well, what is the best way to address these kind of problems? And so I suspect we will see more and more of this as China sort of develops into that kind of role. So I think it's a really good point.
Yeah, no, I agree. Now, speaking of other countries with capabilities, look, worth noting, and this goes back a little bit to June now. I know there's a huge debate at the moment with the US not only pushing Australia in the region to increase defence spending, also pushing Japan to increase defence spending, and we've spoken about that. But Japan has been doing a lot of amazing things when it comes to capability. They have developed a number of their own organic capabilities. We've spoken previously about the shipbuilding. And I think we might have mentioned this before, but their Type 88 missile, so they've just done, their ground self-defense force has just done their first ever domestic live firing. I think they actually fired one during the last Talisman Sabre from Australia. I'd have to check the facts, but I think that's right. But the first domestic live firing of a ground-based anti-ship missile from Japanese territory, a missile, the Type 88, that they have fully developed themselves. So I think that's kind of worth noting in terms of the development of Japan's capabilities. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. They're very much pushing this and they even framed the announcement around the need to get more personnel trained and experiencing this. And this is not something that you can do, because previously they've done most of their test firings either in the US on their ranges or in Australia. And because of the confined waters and everything else around Japan, I think they do less around there. And so I think they're very much framing this as, we need to get more and more people trained up on this. There was also some reporting, and I can't remember, in the past few weeks about the deployment of more of these missiles into the southern islands around Japan's southern islands around Okinawa. So really kind of a focus on this, which I think is interesting. And I find it really fascinating that the way we're seeing nations of all stripes now really pushing into the land-based anti-ship missile sort of envelope. And what impact does this have on maritime strategy? How do you actually use navies in this kind of environment? So I think there's some really interesting kind of questions there. And the Japanese are, again, as I say, and as you mentioned, they are doing this sort of domestically, in addition to the Chinese obviously doing it with their long-range missiles, and increasingly the Americans doing it as well, and Australia getting involved. So there's a lot of people getting onto this bandwagon, and I think it's going to have some pretty profound effects on the way navies are used and how kind of maritime strategy works. So yeah,
we do have to wrap up soon, so we should talk very briefly about the LHD ANAO report. So the Australian National Audit Office, for those that are not in Australia or for those that don't care about the ANAO either, often produce really useful reports where they deep dive into a whole range of things across Australia, but often defence capabilities. And it's when you learn probably the most about some of our capability acquisitions. So I think we've spoken before about what I think was a pretty influential ANAO audit report in 2019 that actually looked at the state of the Anzac class frigates and kind of explains how we got to our current point in terms of Australian frigate capability acquisition. So the ANAO has recently released a report into Defence's sustainment of Canberra-class amphibious assault ships. It got a lot of media here in Australia. Look, in terms of the key findings, look, they're not particularly positive. So it says Defence's arrangements for the sustainment of Navy's LHDs have been partially effective. Defence did not plan effectively for the transition from acquisition to sustainment. Value for money was not clearly demonstrated, and probity was not well managed in the three relevant procurement activities. And we see this a lot, this often, and even when we talk about capabilities, right? Even right now, when the AUKUS debate, when people say, just go and get some B1s, there's a whole lot of problems with that argument. But stepping aside from the problems with that argument, when people quote the cost of B1s, and I wrote a piece about this, they don't talk about sustainment. We often throw out acquisition costs and say, well, that's, it costs like I'm making this up, but, $1 billion for a B1. And you're like, no. There's all the sustainment, right? There's the fundamental inputs to capability. So the criticism of ANAO is that Defence didn't effectively plan for the transition from just acquiring the capability to actually being able to maintain, sustain its spares, etc. It says that Defence has not managed its LHD sustainment contracts effectively. The LHDs have operated with ongoing deficiencies and have experienced critical failures during operations. And look, that's been clear to see. A couple of years ago, we saw the issue with one of the LHDs deployed to support an earthquake off, I think it was Tonga, which clearly had some issues. There were photos. I don't know how true they were of portaloos on the upper decks and things like that. And then the final finding was that monitoring and reporting in respect to LHD sustainment outcomes, the extent to which Navy's requirements have been met, and the implementation of the maritime sustainment models has been partially effective. So kind of indicating that a lot of these issues were not necessarily reported through to the hierarchy either. They make a series of recommendations, and the report, look, you can certainly find the report online. We can put a link in the show notes. It's a worthwhile read. It probably, my take, look, there's a number of things that need to be addressed there. But I think that it probably comes at a bad time for the Department of Defence in terms of, we're looking forward to AUKUS. We have quite an ambitious shipbuilding program, from the Hunter-class frigates to the general-purpose frigates to the Army's amphibious capability to nuclear-powered submarines. And this kind of adds to some of the concern. You mentioned the AORs, Supply and Stalwart. Look, I'm actually not sure of their current capability, but certainly the last reporting I saw in estimates is that both of them were unserviceable, and haven't seen any photos to indicate that is different. Now we know there's issues with the LHD. We also know that there is issues with the planned Collins-class life type upgrade. There was a reporting early in the year or late last year that the first one is not going to go through the full life type. And to be honest, I think everybody kind of expected that that's not going to go as planned. So I think just in the background of that, this LHD report just kind of highlights that there are more issues. There was an interesting piece in The Strategist from David Uren that I would commend to you that actually talks about one aspect of this. I mean, there's a whole bunch of challenges with this. But one aspect is actually when you have a tight defence budget and you are not putting enough money into sustaining capabilities. Now, part of that is because you're needing to spend that on acquisition, which we know is a problem with the current Department of Defence, but also because sustainment for other capabilities that are old is beyond what is budgeted. And we know that the Anzac class is costing a lot to sustain them, for example, which is most likely why HMAS Anzac was decommissioned this year. So LHD, ANAO, audit report, what's your take, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't make overly happy reading. I'm not entirely sure how many ANAO reports do often make hugely happy reading.
I have actually seen some. I'm trying to think of the project now. I actually looked at one for a defense project where I was actually looking for some juicy goss, and it basically said, "Yeah, this is fine." I wish I could find it. Occasionally.
The rule generally is that these things are not hugely positive. I don't think this is quite a Hunter class ANO report level of. I'm trying to use a nice word here, but failure. But I think that it's pretty clear there are some significant issues, and I would. And I don't know whether this is kind of my slant, but I would immediately sort of go to the points that you were just raising there about the fact that the Department of Defense is trying to do a huge amount at the moment, and is in a really difficult kind of transition period. And I know these things often feel like transition periods, and you feel like the organization is always transitioning to get to a better phase, and it never quite gets there. But I feel that actually you can really see Australian defence as being in one of those kind of transition periods where they are trying desperately to eke as much as they can out of the existing capability, particularly obviously the Anzacs, but also other platforms as well, and Collins, I guess. At the same time, they are desperately trying to and have embarked upon an incredibly ambitious program of acquisitions. And I think you could potentially make the argument that in some ways, and I know from a capability standpoint, you're going to push back on me, but in some ways, it's perhaps too ambitious in terms of trying to do too much, certainly domestically. But within the frames of the budget and the personnel and the timeframes that they have, and so something is always going to drop, and invariably, historically, and I would argue sort of to today, maintenance and sustainment is one of the things that gets dropped, right? And it's one of the budget lines that gets cut or gets there's limited. They try and cut the growth on particularly maintenance and sustainment costs in order to push money into higher profile acquisitions. And I find it. Well, I think that this is evidence of that, and I think you're going to see more and more of these kind of challenges. And I think we both, I think, agree that the Australian government is going to have to spend some more money on defence. But I think one of the most important things they're going to have to do actually is put in the money to be able to do the things that they think they can do at the moment, in order to up stuff like sustainment and maintenance budgets, and try and get, in order to be able to eke sufficient capability out to get to the point of time where the new acquisitions begin to come in. And I think this is just going to be a recurring kind of challenge going forward until some of these new capabilities hit the fleet. So that will be my take. But whether or not that is particularly insightful from the inside, I don't know. But that would be my perspective from the outside.
It's always insightful. I just got to highlight for anyone's watching the video that as this progresses, Richard looks like he's getting smaller and smaller. You look like you just.
I'm sliding down the chair in depression.
Yeah, well, it is depressing. Look, I agree with you broadly. I guess, I think that you're right. All of the things going on are incredibly challenging. Now, throw into that now a structural review that Richard Marles announced, the Australian Deputy Prime Minister, about 3 weeks ago at the Defending Australia conference. There is a lot going on, and I think it is a capacity issue. But where I kind of raise my eyebrows about the ambitiousness, I actually don't think we're being ambitious enough. I do not think that our plans meet our strategy or the threat assessment that the government has publicly released in the unclassified domain. I do think that we have a way of overcomplicating things. Now, easy to say on the outside, harder to fix on the inside. So not necessarily a huge criticism, but I just point to the general purpose frigate, for example. I mean, if our strategic circumstances are the way they are, why didn't we make the decision on what we're going to acquire during the DSR or thereafter? Like, we are over 2 years down the track from the DSR, and we've down selected to 2. Rumored the decision's coming in the next couple of weeks, but to me, we've just lost years there. And yes, absolutely, you need to assess risk, but in this kind of strategic circumstances, you need to accept a higher degree of risk. Now, I'm oversimplifying that, but I just think that we could be more ambitious on some of these things. And I do wonder how much of this actually comes from things just being so complicated. And for example, right, a lot of the media reporting about the ANAO audit report of the LHD was quite critical of Navy. But actually, when you get into the LHD report, the Navy is not responsible for the workforce. The Navy is not responsible for the key sustainment contracts. Like, we have such a complicated structure that, I mean, the Navy in Australia is not responsible for naval shipbuilding. So I think that those structures complicate it, whether it be the new PERS structure, which I support broadly, but not fully, or the Naval Shipbuilding Sustainment Group. Like, all of these things mean that actually one organisation is just not responsible for it, which means it's harder to solve the problem. So I think that in some ways, yes, it's about too much going on, but also in some ways it's about our processes are just too convoluted with too many interested parties.
The attack on Arthur Tang is I'm sure about to come.
I actually, for those that don't know, Arthur Tang, previous Secretary of Defence, also maybe Secretary of Defence. Anyway, famous Mandarin in Australia who did a review in the 70s, which reduced the role of the Chiefs of Services, established the Chief of the Defence Force, or I don't think it was called the Chief of Defence Force, but around that. I actually do have a half-drafted article about the role of the Chief of Service, and I think this is this real conversation. And I think I mentioned I had a piece in Fin Review in the lead up to the election campaign that talked about what is the ideal structure of defence, and none of it's perfect. But is this integration, the reduction of the role of the Chiefs of Services, is that actually helping us? And my top line thoughts are no, I don't think it is. Anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a can of worms for another discussion. But I think that there's certainly an argument that we have followed down American lines too far with a force that's fundamentally different in scale and size. And I think you can absolutely make that argument. But I think there's also the counter critique. There's a problem with every system. And so no one system is perfect. You've just got to find the least worst one for your kind of scenario. Whether or not ours is the least worst one for our current situation, I'm not sure. So I think that's all we've got time for, literally, today. So thanks a lot, Jen. That was great.
Thanks so much, Richard.